The afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows of the library, casting golden light across the Persian rug and the leather-bound books lining the mahogany shelves. Alexander Hayes lay on the velvet sofa, eyes closed, breathing slow and even. To anyone watching, he appeared to be sleeping, but behind his closed eyelids he was completely awake and alert. At 42, Alexander had built Hayes Capital into one of the most successful investment firms in the country. He'd learned early in his career that the best way to understand people was to watch them when they thought no one was looking. That's when their true character showed. Which is why, for the past week, he'd been pretending to fall asleep during his afternoon rest while his newest housekeeper cleaned the library. Alexander had been through 7 housekeepers in the past year. They'd all seemed perfect during the interview process. Professional, efficient, trustworthy, and they'd all eventually disappointed him. Missing jewelry, money gone from his desk drawer. One had even tried to sell photos of his home to a tabloid. His house manager, Mrs. Chen, had been apologetic when she hired the latest replacement. "She's young, Mr. Hayes, only 24. She's working multiple jobs to pay off her late father's medical debt. I know you prefer more experienced staff, but something about her felt right. She's honest. I can tell." "We'll see," Alexander had said, already skeptical. Her name was Emma Foster. She was small, maybe 5'4", with blonde hair she kept pulled back in a practical ponytail, usually with a white headband to keep any stray strands out of her face. She wore a simple uniform, a white short-sleeved shirt with a gray vest and dark skirt, sensible flats. She barely made eye contact when spoken to, answered questions in barely more than whispers, and seemed to shrink into herself whenever Alexander entered a room. "Shy," Mrs. Chen had said. Not sneaky, shy. Alexander had learned the hard way that shy people could be just as dishonest as bold ones. Sometimes more so, because no one suspected them. So he'd decided to test her. Every afternoon for the past week, he'd positioned himself on the library sofa, pretending to fall asleep while Emma cleaned. He'd left increasingly tempting items on the round table near the sofa. First, just some papers and a book, nothing valuable. Emma had carefully cleaned around them, then left quietly. The next day, he'd left his phone on the table. Worth over $1,000. Emma had dusted around it, never touching it, then left. Day 3, he'd left his wallet. Emma had cleaned the table carefully, moving the wallet only to wipe beneath it, then placing it back exactly where it had been. Yesterday, he'd left a stack of $100 bills. 10 of them fanned out like he'd been counting and dozed off. Emma had frozen when she saw them. Alexander had watched through barely cracked eyelids as she stood there for a full minute, staring at the money. Her hand had lifted, trembling slightly. Then she'd carefully dusted around the bills, never touching them, and left the room quietly. Today was the final test. This morning, Alexander had left $5,000 in cash spread across the table. Mixed bills, hundreds and fifties. An amount large enough to be life-changing for someone working multiple jobs to pay off debt. An amount that would solve so many of Emma's problems. He heard the door open, soft footsteps on the rug. Emma's quiet breathing as she entered the room. He kept his own breathing slow and steady, the picture of a man deep in sleep. The footsteps stopped. Emma must have seen the money. Alexander waited. This was the moment. This was when he'd know if Mrs. Chen had been right about her, or if Emma Foster was just another disappointment waiting to happen. He heard movement. Slow, careful. Emma's footsteps approached the table, then stopped. Silence. Long, stretched-out silence. Then a sound that made Alexander's chest tighten, crying, quiet, suppressed, but unmistakable. Emma was crying. Through his barely open eyes, Alexander watched her. She stood at the table, staring at the money with tears streaming down her face. Her hands were clenched at her sides, shaking. She looked at the money the way a drowning person might look at a life preserver just out of reach. Then she did something Alexander didn't expect. Emma reached into her vest pocket and pulled out a small photograph. Even from the sofa, Alexander could see it was old, creased from being carried and looked at many times. Emma held it up, staring at it while tears continued to fall silently down her cheeks. She was speaking, so quietly Alexander almost couldn't hear. "I'm sorry, Dad. I know this would solve everything. I know it would pay off the last of your medical bills. I know I could finally stop working 3 jobs. I know I could sleep in a real bed instead of on Jenny's couch." Her voice broke. "But you taught me better than this. You taught me that character is who you are when no one's watching. You taught me that stealing is wrong no matter how desperate you are. You taught me that the right thing is still the right thing even when it costs you everything." Emma pressed the photograph to her chest, her whole body shaking with silent sobs. "I miss you so much, Daddy. I'm so tired. I'm working so hard and I'm still barely surviving. But I won't do this. I won't betray everything you taught me. I won't." She tucked the photograph back in her pocket, wiped her tears roughly with the back of her hand, and picked up her cleaning supplies. Carefully, without touching the money, she dusted around it. She cleaned the entire table, moving the bills only when absolutely necessary and placing them back exactly where they'd been. When she finished, she stood there for one more moment, looking at the money with an expression of such pure longing and resignation that Alexander felt something crack in his chest. Then Emma turned and walked toward the door. As she did, she spoke one more time, so quietly Alexander almost missed it. "Thank you, Mr. Hayes, for giving me a job. Even if this is a test, even if you fire me tomorrow for some reason I don't understand, thank you for giving me a chance. Not many people do." The door closed softly behind her. Alexander lay there, frozen. He'd been prepared for her to take the money. He'd been prepared to catch her in the act, to feel vindicated in his cynicism, to tell Mrs. Chen that trust was foolish in this world. He hadn't been prepared for this. For such raw, honest pain, for such unshakable integrity in the face of desperate need. He sat up slowly, staring at the money on the table. $5,000, an amount that meant almost nothing to him, an amount that clearly meant everything to Emma Foster. And she'd walked away from it, not because she didn't need it, but because taking it would have betrayed who she was. Alexander picked up his phone and called Mrs. Chen. "Tell me everything you know about Emma Foster." Over the next hour, Mrs. Chen told him Emma's story. Her father had been a high school teacher. Good man, loved his daughter, raised her alone after her mother left when Emma was 5. When Emma was 20, her father was diagnosed with cancer. Stage 4, no insurance that covered it adequately. Emma had dropped out of college to care for him and work to pay for his treatment. Her father had lived 2 more years. Every day, Emma had worked multiple jobs, slept a few hours, then sat by his bedside. She'd gone into debt, lost her apartment, moved in with a friend. After her father died, she'd kept working, determined to pay off every cent of his medical bills, not because she legally had to, but because it felt like the right thing to do, like honoring his memory. "She works here 5 days a week," Mrs. Chen said. "Then she works evenings at a diner and weekends at a grocery store. She told me once she hasn't had a full night's sleep in 4 years. But she never complains, Mr. Hayes, never. She just works and smiles and thanks me for the opportunity." After the call ended, Alexander sat in his library for a long time, thinking about all the people he'd learned not to trust, about the walls he'd built, about his own comfortable cynicism, about a young woman who'd cried over money she desperately needed, then walked away from it because her father had taught her that character mattered more than comfort. The next morning, Alexander was in his study when Mrs. Chen brought Emma to him. The poor girl looked terrified, her eyes red-rimmed like she'd been crying all night. "You wanted to see me, Mr. Hayes?" Her voice trembled. "Sit down, Emma. Please." She perched on the edge of the chair across from his desk, looking like she might bolt at any moment. Alexander pulled out a folder. "I need to tell you something. For the past week I've been testing you, pretending to sleep while you cleaned the library, leaving increasingly valuable items on the table to see what you'd do." Emma's face went white. "I'm so sorry." "I didn't know. I swear I never touched anything. I would never." "I know you didn't. That's exactly my point." Alexander leaned forward. "Emma, I've been disappointed by a lot of people in my life. I stopped trusting easily years ago. I thought everyone had a price. Everyone would compromise their integrity if the temptation was big enough. Mr. Hayes, I promise Yesterday I left $5,000 on that table. I watched you cry over it. I heard you talking to Yorhi. Father's photograph. Alexander's voice was gentle. I heard you walk away from money that could have changed your life, because taking it would have betrayed who you are. Tears were streaming down Emma's face again. I'm sorry you saw that. I'm sorry, I cried. It was unprofessional. I'll understand if you want to fire me. Fire you? Alexander shook his head. Emma, I'm not firing you. I'm promoting you. She blinked, confused. What? I need someone I can trust. Someone with real integrity. Someone who does the right thing even when it costs them everything. Alexander slid a piece of paper across the desk. This is a contract. I want you to be my personal assistant. The pay is substantial. Full benefits. It's a legitimate position and you'll work for it. But it will be enough that you can quit your other jobs. Pay off your father's medical debt. Find a place to live. Emma stared at the contract like it was written in a foreign language. Mr. Hayes, I don't understand. I'm just a housekeeper. I don't have the qualifications to... You have exactly the qualification I need. You're honest. You're loyal. You're principled even when no one's watching. Alexander's voice was firm. That's rarer and more valuable than any degree or credential. I don't know what to say. Say yes. Let me help you. Not because you need charity, but because you've earned it. Because your father raised you right, and that kind of character should be rewarded, not punished. Emma covered her face with her hands, sobbing. Why? Why would you do this for me? Because you reminded me that good people still exist. That integrity still matters. That not everyone is out for themselves. Alexander's voice grew softer. And because I've spent years being cynical and suspicious and I'm tired of it, you showed me I was wrong. Thank you for that. Emma took the position. Over the next months, she proved to be everything Alexander had hoped. She was intelligent, learning quickly. She was organized and efficient. Most importantly, she was trustworthy. Alexander found himself sharing things with her he'd never told anyone. Business concerns, personal worries, the loneliness that came with success. Emma listened. She offered thoughtful advice. She became not just his assistant, but his friend. 6 months later, Alexander was in the library when Emma brought him his afternoon coffee. She still wore her hair in a ponytail with a headband, though now she wore professional business attire instead of a housekeeper's uniform. Thank you, Emma. Alexander took the coffee, then gestured to the sofa. I was thinking about the day we met. Well, the day I stopped pretending to sleep and started actually talking to you. Emma smiled, sitting in the chair across from him. The day you told me you'd been testing me. I was terrified. I know. I'm sorry about that. It was manipulative. It was effective. You learned who I really am. I did. Alexander paused. Emma, can I ask you something? That day when you were crying over the money on the table, what were you thinking? Emma was quiet for a moment. I was thinking about my father. About the last conversation we had before he died. He told me he was sorry for the debt he was leaving me. Sorry for being a burden. I told him he could never be a burden. That he'd given me everything that mattered. Then he made me promise something. What was that? He made me promise that no matter how hard things got, I wouldn't compromise who I was. He said money comes and goes, opportunities come and go, but character is forever. He said if I lost my integrity trying to survive, I'd lose the only thing he'd really given me. Emma's eyes were bright with tears. So when I saw that money, I wanted it so badly. It would have solved everything. But taking it would have broken my promise to my dad. And I couldn't do that. Alexander felt emotion tighten his throat. He must have been an incredible man. He was. He taught high school English for 30 years. He didn't make much money, but he loved his students. He believed in teaching them not just literature, but how to be good people, how to have integrity, how to choose right over easy. Emma smiled through her tears. He lived those principles. Even at the end, when he was in so much pain and we had no money, he never complained. He just kept teaching me, showing me how to be strong, how to be honest, how to matter. You matter, Emma. You matter so much. Over the next year, Emma became indispensable to Alexander. She managed his schedule, handled sensitive communications, advised him on business decisions. But more than that, she became his conscience. When he was tempted to take ethical shortcuts, she gently reminded him of what mattered. When he was too hard on employees, she advocated for compassion. When he was cynical, she showed him reasons to hope. Alexander found himself looking forward to seeing her every morning. Found himself sharing more and more of his life with her. Found himself thinking about her at odd moments during the day. One evening, almost 18 months after that day in the library, Alexander asked Emma to dinner. Not a business dinner. A real date, are you sure? Emma asked, looking uncertain. I work for you. That makes this complicated. I know. But Emma, these past months, you've become my closest friend. The person I trust most in the world. I'd like to see if there could be something more. If you're interested. Emma's smile was like sunrise. I'm interested. They took things slowly, dating for months before acknowledging what both of them already knew. They were falling in love. On their one-year anniversary, Alexander took Emma back to the library, to the sofa where he'd lain pretending to sleep, to the table where he'd left money to test her. This is where it started, he said, taking her hands. Where I learned that good people still exist. Where you showed me that integrity is real, not just a word. Where I stopped being cynical and started believing in people again. You gave me everything, Alexander. A real job, security, a life that's more than just surviving. You gave me more. You gave me faith. In people, in goodness, in the possibility that not everyone is out for themselves. Alexander pulled out a small box. Emma Foster, would you marry me? Emma's eyes filled with tears. Yes. 1,000 times, yes. They were married 6 months later. Emma's friend Jenny was her maid of honor. Mrs. Chen cried through the entire ceremony. Before the wedding, Emma had visited her father's grave, telling him about Alexander, about how happy she was, about how his lessons had led her to this moment. 2 years later, Alexander stood in the library, watching his wife read to their 6-month-old daughter. The afternoon sun cast golden light across them, and Alexander felt a contentment he'd never imagined possible. What are you thinking about? Emma asked, looking up and catching him staring. About the day I pretended to be asleep on that sofa. About the best decision I ever made, which was giving you a chance. About how close I came to spending my whole life cynical and alone. Emma smiled and patted the sofa beside her. Come sit with us. And this time, no pretending. Alexander sat, putting his arm around his wife and touching his daughter's soft hair. No pretending, just real. All real. All real, Emma agreed, leaning into him. Sometimes the best things in life come from testing people and discovering they're better than you expected. Sometimes cynicism breaks when it encounters genuine goodness. Sometimes the person you're testing ends up teaching you more than you ever taught them. Alexander had been testing Emma to see if she was trustworthy. Instead, she'd tested him, challenging his assumptions, his cynicism, his walls, and they'd both passed. They'd both learned. They'd both been transformed. That, Alexander thought, pulling his family closer, was the real test. Not whether Emma would take the money, but whether Alexander would recognize the rare and precious thing he'd found when he saw it. Whether he'd be brave enough to let her into his life. Whether he'd be wise enough to see that sometimes the poorest people are the richest in the ways that matter most. He'd found his answer that day in the library, watching a young woman cry over money she desperately needed, then walk away from it because taking it would cost something more precious than comfort. It would cost her soul, her integrity, the promise she'd made to her father, the person she'd chosen to be. And in choosing to be that person, Emma Foster had given Alexander Hayes the greatest gift of his life. She'd given him faith, in goodness, in people, in love. And in return, Alexander had given her the one thing she'd never asked for, but always deserved. Someone who saw her value, who recognized her character, who loved her not despite her integrity, but because of it. They'd both found what they were looking for. Alexander had found trust. Emma had found home. And together, they'd found each other.